On a bright June afternoon, the village of Little Bramble found itself dressed in its cheerful best. Bunting fluttered in the mild breeze, tables were set with lace cloths, and the annual St. Mildred's Garden Fête promised homemade jams, hand-embroidered linens, and gossip as sweet as the sponge cakes on display. It was precisely the kind of peaceful, picturesque scene that made visitors sigh with envy, and long-time residents assure themselves that nothing truly dreadful ever happened in such a place. But as Miss Jane Marple often observed, usually while folding her knitting neatly into her lap, such assurances tended to precede trouble. She sat beneath a striped tent, a cooling glass of lemonade at her side, watching with serene interest as the villagers milled about. Even at her age, nothing delighted her more than watching human nature unfold in its gentle, predictable patterns. Mrs. Price fussed over her preserves. Young Tommy Ellis lingered too long near the pastry table with the wide-eyed admiration only children reserved for sugar, and the Reverend Creston practiced a smile that was, in Miss Marple's opinion, far too strained for a man merely overseeing a tombola. Everything was exactly as it always was, until it wasn't. The moment of disruption arrived quietly at first, carried on the whispers of the crowd. Someone noted that Mrs. Hardwell's new maid hadn't returned from her noon break. Others chimed in, claiming they hadn't seen the girl all day. No, not since just before lunch, when she'd been sent to fetch lemonade from the refreshment tent. A few shrugged. Maids came and went, especially young ones unsettled by the tedium of domestic work. But Mrs. Hardwell's manner, flurried, stiff, with a frightened sort of tremor about her mouth, told a different story. Miss Marple noticed it at once. "My dear," said Mrs. Hardwell when they finally crossed paths, her voice thin as a pressed flower. "You haven't seen Elsie, have you? My maid, slim little thing, brown hair, blue dress. She went out just before noon and hasn't returned." "No, indeed," Miss Marple replied gently. "Have you checked the tents along the green? Sometimes a young girl may be distracted by some excitement." "I've checked everywhere," Mrs. Hardwell whispered, clutching her handbag. "She wouldn't wander. She's a sensible girl, very sensible." Sensible girls did not simply disappear. Miss Marple knew this, but she offered no alarming remark. Panic never aided deduction. Instead, she observed, a small knot of villagers had formed around the Hardwell household's longtime gardener, Mr. Aberline, who scratched his wiry beard as he gave his account. "Saw her walk toward the north path, the one leading to the old mill," he said. "Didn't think much of it. Looked like she was meeting someone, though." She paused, looked over her shoulder. "Meeting someone?" cried Mrs. Baxter, who smelled gossip like a bloodhound. "Couldn't see who," the gardener replied. The words spread swiftly, eager tongues turning uncertainty into narrative. Meeting a man. Running away. Secret trouble, surely. Maybe she wasn't as sensible as she seemed. Miss Marple listened quietly, noting who repeated which theories, who embellished them, and who appeared unsettled for reasons that had nothing to do with Elsie. Then the tone of the crowd changed again, sharpened, tightened, when Constable Reed jogged toward the Fête grounds, his helmet askew, his cheeks flushed. "Everyone remain calm," he called out, which had the predictable effect of heightening everyone's agitation. "We've found something near the mill, something of the girls." Mrs. Hardwell swayed, and Miss Marple reached out, steady as ever, catching her arm before she could fall. "What exactly was found, Constable?" Miss Marple asked in her mildest voice. Reed swallowed. "Her apron, ma'am. Torn, and blood on the edge of it." A hush rolled across the Fête grounds like a cold wind. The cheerful bunting no longer fluttered. It hung, still accusing, as if aware that the tranquility of Little Bramble had ripped just as violently as that torn apron. Miss Marple took a deep breath, her eyes narrowing the slightest bit. She had seen such things before. Village scandals, disappearances, tragedies dressed as accidents, and she never underestimated what people were capable of when secrets pressed too heavily upon them. Somewhere among these familiar faces, beneath the polite smiles and summer hats, lay the reason a young maid had vanished at noon. And Miss Marple, with her quiet gaze and tireless understanding of human frailty, had already begun to sift through the possibilities. The news of the torn apron spread across Little Bramble faster than warm butter melting on a scone. Within minutes, the cheerful hum of the Fête had twisted into a low buzz of anxious chatter. Children were ushered away from the green, stalls were left half-tended, and the once pleasant afternoon took on a peculiar heaviness, like a storm that had lost its way but lingered over the village out of spite. Miss Marple remained seated beneath the striped tent, her knitting resting untouched in her lap. She had no desire to join the hubbub forming around Constable Reed. People in groups seldom produced useful information. Individual reactions, however, were often far more revealing. "Blood," murmured Mrs. Baxter, pressing a hand to her chest. "It's simply dreadful. And to think, on the day of the Fête, these things always happen at the worst possible moments." "It's only a little blood," countered Mr. Fenimore, the shopkeeper, although his voice quivered. "Could be anything. A nosebleed, perhaps. On an apron that was torn?" "Really, Mr. Fenimore," replied Mrs. Baxter, who rarely missed an opportunity to improve the drama of any situation. Miss Marple observed the exchange with an inward sigh. People were remarkably predictable when fear arrived. Some exaggerated, some denied, and some, like Mr. Aberline the gardener, retreated into a stoic silence that usually suggested more knowledge than comfort. Mrs. Hardwell, meanwhile, clung to her husband's arm, her pale face tilted toward the ground. Mr. Hardwell, a tall, rigid man who prided himself on order and decency, kept his jaw clenched so tightly that one might have mistaken him for carved marble. He nodded curtly at those who approached, but his eyes darted constantly, scanning the crowd as though expecting Elsie herself to emerge and explain the entire matter away. Miss Marple made a mental note of his agitation. Not the worry of a kind employer, but something sharper, something defensive. Across the lawn, young Tommy Ellis tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Mum, did the maid get murdered?" His voice was filled with a child's terrible fascination, the sort fueled by bedtime ghost stories and overheard adult conversations. "Hush, Tommy," his mother whispered urgently, though she glanced toward the mill path with a fearful shudder. "We don't know anything for certain." "No," Miss Marple thought. "Indeed we don't. But there were always people who believed they knew. Mr. and Mrs. Penberthy, the village's most enthusiastic gossips, had already built an entire story around the disappearance. "Mark my words," Mr. Penberthy declared to a growing circle. "The girl ran off with a traveling salesman. Those types are everywhere these days. Slick words, empty promises." "Nonsense," sniffed Mrs. Penberthy. "It was something far more sinister. Didn't you hear? Someone saw her arguing with a man near the mill only last week." This, Miss Marple noted, was completely fabricated. Mrs. Penberthy had a talent for filling the gaps of truth with colorful inventions, and yet sometimes her inventions landed amusingly near something real. "Excuse me," Miss Marple said gently, rising from her chair. "I wonder who exactly saw this argument you mentioned?" Mrs. Penberthy blinked, caught between maintaining the tale and sparing herself embarrassment. "Well, I heard Mrs. Woodhouse mention something of the sort." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Mrs. Woodhouse has been in Bath for the last fortnight visiting her sister." Several heads turned toward Mrs. Penberthy, who sputtered and waved away the detail. "Well, someone must have seen it," she muttered. Miss Marple returned to her seat as the murmurs resumed, quietly satisfied. A false rumor often revealed more about the teller than the tale. Just then, Constable Reed approached the tent, his helmet finally straightened. He was a decent young man, earnest good-hearted, and entirely unused to any crime more serious than a stolen bicycle. "Miss Marple," he said, slightly out of breath, "may I have a word?" "Of course, Constable." "Is there any news?" "We found no sign of the girl besides the apron, but there were footprints. 2 sets. One smaller, likely hers. The other, possibly a man's. Hard to tell with the mud." "And were they going toward the mill?" Miss Marple asked softly. "Or away from it?" Reed hesitated. "Toward it, then nothing. As if the ground swallowed them." Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. People rarely vanished into thin air, but they often disappeared into places others had forgotten about. "And the villagers?" she asked. "What are they saying?" "Oh, all sorts of things." Reed sighed. "Running off, abduction, romance gone wrong. You know how they are." "Oh, yes," Miss Marple said. "I do indeed." She watched Reed hurry away before turning her gaze once more to the crowd. Behind the shock and the exaggerated theories lay something far more meaningful. Guilt, fear, curiosity, and little slips of truth buried in lies. She noticed Mr. Hardwell whispering urgently to his wife, who looked as though she might faint. The gardener, Mr. Aberline, paced near the tea table, wringing his hands. Young Lucy Farnham, who worked at the post office and had always been envious of Elsie's easy charm, looked unusually pale, and Mrs. Baxter hovered as though hoping to overhear something scandalous, yet her eyes flicked nervously toward the northern path every few seconds. Human nature was, after all, wonderfully revealing, but one face stood out most of all. Near the edge of the Fête grounds, half hidden behind a row of rose bushes, stood a young man Miss Marple didn't recognize. He wasn't part of the usual village circle. His clothing was too neat, his stance too restless, his gaze too watchful. And though he tried very hard not to attract attention, Miss Marple noticed him all the same. She always did. "Who are you, my young man? And why are you so very interested in the disappearance of a village maid you haven't even asked about?" Miss Marple folded her hands together and inhaled calmly. The village had reacted. Loudly, chaotically, predictably. Now it was time to begin listening for what people weren't saying. Constable Reed organized a search party with a mixture of determination and visible anxiety, for Little Bramble had never required such a thing. The villagers volunteered readily, though their eagerness was tinged with a nervous thrill. Nothing delighted the human mind quite like danger, provided it stayed just far enough away. Groups moved toward the woods, the riverbank, and the winding path to the old mill. Reed gave instructions in his somewhat wobbly, authoritative voice, and lanterns were collected from the church hall in case daylight failed before answers were found. Miss Marple did not join the searchers. She rarely rushed into brambles when a mystery arose. There was far more to learn in conversation than in undergrowth. Instead, she strolled calmly toward the refreshments tent where Mrs. Rowland, the vicar's wife, was packing away leftover sponge cakes with trembling hands. "My dear," Miss Marple began gently, "you seem quite upset." Mrs. Rowland sighed. "It's dreadful, simply dreadful. Poor Elsie. I keep thinking, what if she's hurt somewhere, alone? And then the children. Oh, I do hope they don't hear about the blood." "Children hear more than we imagine," Miss Marple murmured. "Tell me, did you know Elsie well?" "Not closely, but she was always polite, a bit shy, and she was so grateful to have work after, well," she hesitated. "After what?" Miss Marple asked innocently. "Oh, Miss Marple, I shouldn't say. It's not proper." "Quite," Miss Marple agreed. "Still, in delicate circumstances, the more one understands, the better one can help." Mrs. Rowland's resolve crumbled at the gentle nudge. Her mother told Mrs. Hardwell that Elsie had come from a difficult situation, something about a disagreement with a previous employer, but Mrs. Hardwell never pressed for details. She said the girl seemed earnest enough. Miss Marple nodded. And did Elsie have friends here in the village? Not many. She'd only been here 6 weeks, though Lucy Farnham at the post office invited her to tea once or twice. But Lucy said Elsie declined. Something about being too tired. Miss Marple tucked that away. Tired maids sometimes had secret hopes, long walks, clandestine letters, or they were simply overworked. In mysteries of human behavior, all paths were possible until one proved otherwise. As she turned to leave, Miss Marple spotted Mr. Hardwells striding briskly toward the mill path, jaw clenched, hands balled at his sides. His wife watched him go with a mixture of worry and something else. Resentment. Fear. Hard to tell, but emotions were rarely singular. Just as Miss Marple contemplated following at a distance, she noticed another figure, Lucy Farnham, slipping away from the crowd. Not toward the search parties, but toward the back of the vicarage garden, where no one was likely to notice her, except Miss Marple. Now, why would a young woman sneak away at a time like this? Curiosity piqued, Miss Marple followed at a polite, unhurried pace. She found Lucy standing behind the old stone wall, wiping her eyes with the edge of her sleeve. "My dear," Miss Marple said softly, "is something troubling you?" Lucy started. "Miss Marple, I was just... It's all so awful. Elsie disappearing and all those horrible things people are saying. Yes, gossip spreads quickly, but tears rarely come from gossip alone," Miss Marple said. Lucy hesitated, then crumpled. "It's just... I should have insisted she come to tea today. I asked her and she said she had an errand. She looked so tired lately, like she wasn't sleeping properly. I thought maybe she didn't like me." More tears, spilled. But now, what if something was wrong all along? Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on her arm. "Did she say where she was going?" Lucy sniffed. "No, but she had a letter this morning. I saw her reading it when she thought no one was watching. She folded it up quickly." "A letter?" Miss Marple repeated softly. "Delivered through the post?" "Yes. Handwritten envelope. No return address." Miss Marple had always believed that letters, like secrets, never appeared without purpose. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "It may be more important than you think." Lucy managed a faint nod, and Miss Marple left her to compose herself. By the time Miss Marple returned to the green, the sun had dipped low, stretching long shadows across the lawn. Constable Reed was speaking with the Hardwells, who looked more distressed by the minute. "We've checked the mill itself, sir," Reed reported. "Nothing there, just old equipment and cobwebs." "What about the river?" Mrs. Hardwell whispered, her voice trembling. Reed shook his head. "Nothing yet." Miss Marple approached quietly. "Excuse me, Constable. Have you found any personal items besides the apron?" Reed frowned. "No, ma'am. Why do you ask?" "I was merely wondering," Miss Marple said mildly, "whether Elsie might have carried something meaningful with her, something that would help us understand her last movements." Mr. Hardwell bristled. "I don't see why an elderly lady should be questioning police matters at a time like this." Mrs. Hardwell gasped softly. "Harold, please." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, not with amusement, but with recognition. When people snapped without reason, it usually meant they were hiding something. "I meant no interference," she said calmly. "Only concern." Reed sighed. "No, Miss Marple. Nothing else was found." She murmured. "Curious. Because letters rarely stayed entirely unnoticed, unless someone had taken great care to hide them." As the villagers continued their frantic efforts, Miss Marple looked again toward the line of rose bushes where she had earlier seen the restless young stranger. He was gone. But the feeling he left behind, a faint chill, a question unasked, lingered. And as Miss Marple watched the final rays of sunlight disappear behind the mill's silhouette, she felt something shift in her thoughts. Elsie hadn't simply vanished. Someone had made certain she would not be found easily, and that someone was closer than anyone yet imagined. By the next morning, Little Bramble was no longer the peaceful village it had always prided itself on being. The church bells, usually ringing with gentle reassurance, seemed to echo with unease. Curtains twitched more than usual, neighbors whispered instead of greeting, and the air carried the peculiar heaviness that only comes when everyone suspects everyone else, but will not admit it. Constable Reed had spent the early hours gathering statements, though his notebook was a confused patchwork of contradictions, half-truths, and mild hysteria. He looked exhausted as he paced outside the Hardwell residence, helmet under his arm, hair sticking up in nervous tufts. Miss Marple, taking her morning walk as she always did, paused by the gate. "You look troubled, Constable." Reed sighed. "More than troubled, Miss Marple. The more I ask people what they saw, the less sense anything makes. Half the village claims they saw Elsie heading to the mill. The other half says she was seen going in the opposite direction, and someone even insisted she boarded a bus, though the driver says otherwise. That is the difficulty with witnesses," Miss Marple said kindly. "They tend to see not what happened, but what they believe should have happened." Reed managed a tired chuckle. "I suppose that's true. Still, I don't know where to begin." "Oh, but I think you do," Miss Marple murmured. "Tell me, who are the villagers whispering about this morning?" Reed flipped through his notebook. "Well, Mr. Hardwell, for one." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, though not with surprise. "Indeed? And why is that?" "He's irritable," Reed said, choosing his words carefully. "More than usual. Several people said they saw him arguing with Elsie last week." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And did they specify the nature of the argument?" "No, ma'am." "Meaning they likely imagined the rest," Miss Marple said. Still, irritation was not an irrelevant detail. Mr. Hardwell's stiff demeanor often masked temper. "What about the gardener?" she asked. "Mr. Aberline?" Reed brightened slightly. "Funny you should mention him. He was one of the last to see her, but now he says he doesn't remember clearly. Claims the sun was in his eyes." Reed shuffled uncomfortably. "His story keeps changing. I don't like it." "People who lie often change their stories," Miss Marple said, "though those who panic also do the same." "True," Reed admitted. "Then there's Lucy Farnham." "Ah," Miss Marple said softly. "Lucy. She said she barely knew the maid, but several villagers told me Lucy was jealous of Elsie's good looks, said she felt overshadowed." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Jealousy is a powerful emotion, Constable, but rarely a violent one in such cases. Did Lucy offer any details that seemed too helpful?" Reed blinked. "Now that you mention it, yes. She said Elsie seemed frightened lately, that she might have had a secret." "A secret," Miss Marple repeated. "Isn't it fascinating how even the mildest people assume secrets are always sinister?" Reed nodded slowly. "And then there's the stranger." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused mid-air. "Stranger? Yes, a man no one recognized. Several villagers saw him near the Fête. Dark jacket, clean-shaven, seemed nervous." Reed flipped a page. Mrs. Penberthy said he was lurking. Of course, she says that about anyone she doesn't know. "Did he speak to anyone?" "So far as I can tell, no. But he vanished before anyone could ask who he was." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with interest. "Visitors are often overlooked, unless they wish to be noticed." Reed sighed. "So many suspects, Miss Marple, and not a scrap of real evidence." "Oh, there is evidence," Miss Marple said gently. "It is simply quiet." Later that morning, Miss Marple paid a visit to the Hardwells under the guise of delivering a small pot of rosehip jam. Mrs. Hardwell answered the door, her eyes red from crying, her hair hastily pinned. "Oh, Miss Marple, How kind. She stepped aside. Please come in. Mr. Hardwell stood near the mantelpiece, posture rigid, jaw clenched. He managed a stiff nod. I'm terribly sorry for your distress, Miss Marple began. I thought perhaps a small comfort might help. Mrs. Hardwell offered a weak smile. Thank you. I don't know what to think anymore. Miss Marple observed the room with quiet interest. Elsie's absence hung in the air like a missing piece of furniture, felt more than seen. Did Elsie ever mention any acquaintances here in Little Bramble? Miss Marple asked. No, Mrs. Hardwell said, but she was so private. Mr. Hardwell cleared his throat sharply. This line of questioning isn't helpful, Miss Marple. The police will handle the matter. Miss Marple looked at him with gentle eyes. I merely wish to understand. You see, the truth often lies not in bold statements, but in subtle omissions. He stiffened. Mrs. Hardwell's hands trembled. She was a good worker, quiet, diligent. Oh, Harold, why are you so tense? It frightens me, Mr. Hardwell snapped, because everyone expects us to know something we do not. Miss Marple quietly filed that reaction away. It was not guilt, necessarily, but it was not innocence either. Not entirely. Miss Marple next found Mr. Aberline pruning roses with unnecessary force. His hands shook slightly. Good morning, Mr. Aberline. Miss Marple greeted him. He jumped. Oh, Miss Marple, didn't see you there. You seem troubled. Who wouldn't be? He muttered. Poor girl. Poor little thing. Miss Marple studied him. You mentioned seeing her yesterday, toward the mill. He swallowed. Aye, that's what I said. Is it what you remember? She asked softly. Silence. A long, uncomfortable silence. Then reluctantly. Truth is, I'm not sure anymore. I saw someone in a blue dress, but the distance, the sun. He looked at the ground. Maybe it wasn't her. Or maybe you wish you hadn't seen her? Miss Marple asked gently. His eyes darted up, panicked. Why would you say that? Human nature, Mr. Aberline. People often doubt their eyes when they fear what they saw. His lip quivered. I didn't do nothing, Miss Marple. I swear it. I know, she said kindly, but perhaps you saw more than you realized. Lucy avoided Miss Marple entirely that day, an act which, in itself, drew more attention than any conversation might have. Guilt, Miss Marple knew, did not always represent wrongdoing. Sometimes it merely represented knowledge. And knowledge was often far more dangerous. He did not reappear. No one knew his name. No one knew where he'd gone. But as the sun began to set on the second day of Elsie's disappearance, Miss Marple felt certain of one thing. This was no simple case of a runaway maid. Someone had reason for Elsie to vanish, and someone in Little Bramble was working very hard to appear ordinary. Miss Marple drew her shawl closer around her shoulders and walked slowly home. Patterns were forming, threads tightening. Soon she would see which thread, when pulled, unraveled the entire tapestry. By the third morning, Little Bramble's unease had hardened into something heavier, fear disguised as routine. People baked bread, swept porches, tended to gardens, all with a peculiar stiffness, as though normality itself required conscious effort. And yet beneath the surface of every polite nod and forced smile, there pulsed a single question. Where was Elsie? Miss Marple, however, did not waste her morning with speculation. She began with her customary walk, though today she took a particular path, one she had quietly intended to explore since the moment Constable Reed mentioned the bloodied apron found near the old mill. Most had assumed the path held no further secrets. The search party had come through thoroughly, leaving footprints and broken twigs in their wake. But Miss Marple was not looking for the obvious. She was interested in what the eager lantern-holding villagers had ignored. The north path was narrow, shaded by overhanging oak branches. A cool breeze carried the faint scent of river water. Birds chattered softly, as if unaware or unbothered by the village's distress. Miss Marple walked slowly, eyes fixed not ahead but around. The undergrowth, the small depressions in the soil, the way leaves lay disturbed. She paused near a cluster of blackberry bushes. Several berries were crushed, not freshly, but just recently enough to catch her attention. She crouched with the ease of someone who had practiced such motions for nearly 9 decades. There, caught on a thorn, a single thread, pale blue, Elsie's dress. Miss Marple examined it with delicate fingers. Most would think little of such a thing. After all, Elsie had walked this path. But Miss Marple noticed something else. A second thread, not blue, white, rougher in texture, almost like apron fabric, but not the torn apron Constable Reed recovered. This was from a different cloth, thicker, coarser. Miss Marple held both threads between her fingers, eyes narrowing. 2 aprons. No one had mentioned Elsie being given or wearing a second apron. Mrs. Hardwell was exceptionally particular about house uniforms. Her maids received 1 apron and, if lucky, a spare. Miss Marple doubted Elsie had earned such trust so quickly. She looked deeper into the brambles, and there, half hidden beneath a leaf, was a small, silvery object. Miss Marple gently uncovered it. A brass key, no rust. Recently polished, and attached to it by a tiny chain was a thin metal tag engraved with 1 word: backroom. Miss Marple's breath caught ever so slightly. The only building in Little Bramble with a backroom key was Hardwells' general store. Mr. Hardwell's pride, financial backbone, and personal fiefdom. And Elsie had no reason whatsoever to possess such a key, unless someone had given it to her, or unless she had taken it. Miss Marple tucked the key safely into her handbag, her expression thoughtful. The pieces were shifting, subtly, quietly, into new alignment. She rose and resumed her walk, moving now toward the mill. It loomed ahead, its wooden frame weathered, its windows dark and shuttered. From a distance, it seemed harmless, idle relic of a past industry, but Miss Marple never trusted abandoned places. They told stories too easily ignored. She stepped inside the mill's wide entrance. The air was still. Dust motes floated like faint ghosts. Old tools hung on nails. A torn canvas sack rested in a corner. But nothing here seemed disturbed, not since the search party left heavy boot marks everywhere. Miss Marple scanned the floor. Footprints overlapped chaotically, but near the back wall where novices rarely looked, a smaller, lighter impression stood out, barely noticeable. Not a boot, not a man's shoe, a woman's step. Too small for Mrs. Hardwell, too narrow for Lucy, too timid for Mrs. Penberthy, Elsie. But there was something else, parallel to her step, a scrape, a drag mark, very faint, as though something or someone had been pulled or forced. Miss Marple followed the mark to the old trap door at the mill's center. Its iron ring handle was dusty, untouched, yet the mark stopped just before it. She knelt, pressing her palm gently against the wooden board. Cold, but not icy. Recently opened, and recently closed. Before she could investigate further, a sound stirred behind her. Footsteps, quick, deliberate, trying to be quiet. Miss Marple straightened slowly, turning her head just enough to see who had joined her. Mr. Hardwell stood in the doorway, his face stiff, his eyes cold and far too steady for a man searching for a missing maid. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone clipped. "What exactly are you doing in here?" Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "Simply enjoying my morning walk. I always find old buildings quite calming. Don't you?" Hardwell stepped inside, his boots crunching on stray grains of dust. "No," he replied flatly. "I do not." He walked forward, closer until only a few paces separated them. People talk too much in this village, he said. They see shadows where none exist. Oh, Miss Marple said. Shadows often reveal quite a lot, if one looks at the right angle. Hardwell's jaw tightened. I suggest, he said sharply, that you leave the investigation to the authorities. Miss Marple's polite smile never faltered. Of course. Then she turned to leave, her eyes drifting deliberately toward the trap door for half a second, just enough to confirm a suspicion. Hardwell saw that, and it frightened him. More than he wanted to admit. Miss Marple returned to the path with a slow, thoughtful pace. In her handbag lay the first genuine clue of the case. A key that should never have been in Elsie's possession. A key that tied her directly to the Hardwells store. A key that suggested secrets hidden not in the mill, but in the Hardwell family itself. Still, one must never jump to conclusions. Miss Marple had seen many an innocent person become defensive, and many a guilty one appear calm. But she had also learned something else. When a man fears what an elderly woman might discover in a dusty old mill, that man is not fearing the woman, he is fearing the truth. The morning Miss Marple found the key, Little Bramble seemed unusually quiet. Villagers moved about with deliberation, speaking in hushed tones, as though any careless remark might summon further misfortune. But while the general mood suggested fear, Miss Marple sensed something else beneath it. Anticipation. People were waiting, not for answers, but for someone else to be accused first. Constable Reed knocked on Miss Marple's door shortly after midday. He looked overwhelmed but determined, clutching his notebook as though it might steady him. Miss Marple, he began, I need advice. Not official advice, of course. Just guidance. She gestured him inside. Sit down, Constable. Tell me what troubles you. Reed exhaled. It's everyone. Their stories don't match. No one agrees on what Elsie did before noon. Mr. Hardwell claims she went on an errand. Mrs. Hardwell says she was cleaning the pantry. Mr. Aberline said he saw her walking toward the mill, then later said he wasn't sure at all. And Lucy, she insists Elsie was frightened lately, but others say she seemed perfectly normal. Contradictions, Miss Marple said gently, often reveal more than the truth itself. Reed nodded miserably. I just can't tell who's lying and who's confused. Miss Marple folded her hands calmly. Then perhaps you should tell me, in your own words, what each of them said. Precisely. Reed recounted the statements, and Miss Marple listened, her expression soft but intent. What mattered to her was not what people said, but what they left out. And Mr. Hardwell, she asked once Reed finished. Reed hesitated. He said Elsie was sent to fetch polish from the store's back room. Miss Marple looked up sharply. The back room, are you certain? Yes. Why? Because that aligned perfectly with the clue in her handbag, but she did not reveal this, not yet. Instead, she asked, did Mrs. Hardwell confirm that? No, she said she didn't know anything about it. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Couples often lied for each other, or without each other's knowledge, but conflicting lies were far more interesting. As Reed left, Miss Marple stepped outside into the mild afternoon air. The village carried on as always, tidy lawns, clipped hedges, polite waves, but the air felt charged, as though something concealed was close to the surface. She decided to visit Lucy Farnham. Lucy opened her door after a long hesitation. Her eyes were swollen as if she'd cried again. This time, however, she seemed more resolute. Miss Marple, I know why Elsie was upset recently. Miss Marple waited. She got a letter a few days ago. I didn't see the contents, but the handwriting looked masculine. She stuffed it in her pocket so quickly. Lucy swallowed. I asked her if everything was all right, and she said, people think I don't know things, but I do. I didn't understand what she meant. Miss Marple nodded gently. And the morning she vanished. She got another letter. Same handwriting. Did you see where she put it? Lucy paused, then whispered, in her apron pocket. Miss Marple felt a quiet stir of confirmation. The torn apron Reed recovered, the one with blood, had no letter in it, which meant the apron on the ground was not the one she'd been wearing earlier. Someone had swapped them. Quietly, she asked, "Lucy, did Elsie ever mention Mr. Hardwell?" Lucy blinked. No, but she avoided the store unless someone went with her. Miss Marple felt the pieces shift again. With afternoon approaching, Miss Marple made her way to Hardwell's general store. The shop was nearly empty, though Mr. Hardwell stood behind the counter with a rehearsed calm that struck her as entirely artificial. "Miss Marple," he said tightly, "if you've come to discuss Elsie again—" "I've come for polishing oil," Miss Marple said sweetly. "The kind one keeps in the back room. May I collect it myself? I don't wish to trouble you." Hardwell hesitated. "No customers are allowed in the back room." "Oh," she replied mildly, but Elsie was. His face tightened just enough to betray surprise. "I told the constable," he said sharply, "that she went for polish. That's all." "Strange," Miss Marple murmured. Mrs. Hardwell wasn't aware of it. His jaw flickered. "And stranger still," she continued softly, "that the key to your back room should be found near the north path." Hardwell's face drained of color. Just for a moment, but enough. "I don't know what you're implying," he said stiffly. "Oh, I'm not implying," Miss Marple replied pleasantly. "Merely observing." She left the store calmly, leaving Hardwell trembling ever so slightly behind the counter. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, Miss Marple returned to the mill path. Not to search, but to think. Someone had sent Elsie letters. Someone had arranged for her to visit the store's back room. Someone had swapped her apron before the torn one was planted by the mill. Someone was now visibly panicking. And someone else noticed Miss Marple noticing. As she reached the bend in the path, she heard a rustling behind her. She turned slowly. A young man, the same restless stranger she'd seen during the fête, stood there, breathing hard. "You don't know what you're walking into," he said quietly. His voice trembled, but with conviction, not fear. "And you," Miss Marple replied, "seem to know far too much for a visitor." He swallowed. "Elsie didn't run away. She didn't fall. Someone made sure she vanished. And if you're not careful, you'll be next." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, not with fear, but with interest. She had expected a twist, just not this one. They stood facing one another on the narrow path, framed by hedgerows and the faint rustle of leaves. For a moment, neither spoke. Miss Marple regarded the young man with that mild, politely curious expression that had misled so many over the years. He looked as though he had not slept, eyes shadowed, jaw tight, clothes slightly creased. "You seem very certain," Miss Marple said gently, "that Elsie did not simply run away. May I ask your name, young man?" He hesitated, glancing back toward the village as if afraid of being seen. "Daniel Carter," he said at last, "though no one here knows it. I made sure of that." "And your connection to Elsie?" Miss Marple asked. His shoulders stiffened. "She was my cousin, practically my sister. We grew up in the same house." Miss Marple had suspected as much. There was a familiar softness in his voice when he spoke her name, a blend of loyalty and fear. "And yet," Miss Marple said kindly, "you did not introduce yourself when you came to the fête." Daniel's lips pressed into a thin line. "Because the last time I came openly to one of Elsie's employers," he said quietly, "she lost her position within a week." Miss Marple said nothing. He took a breath. "Elsie wrote to me from here, several times. At first she said Little Bramble was peaceful, that the work was hard but fair, and Mrs. Hardwell was not unkind. But then the letters changed. In what way? Miss Marple prompted. She said people here like to pretend nothing bad ever happened, Daniel replied. That under all the polite smiles there was something wrong. She said Mr. Hardwell had secrets, that she wasn't stupid no matter what people thought, her exact words. Miss Marple thought of the key in her handbag. Did she mention the store? Yes, Daniel nodded. She said he kept the back room locked, always, that no one else was allowed in there. Then about a week ago, she wrote that she'd gotten hold of something important. If anything happens to me, she wrote, remember it began with the back room. Miss Marple felt a tiny chill travel along her spine. Did she say how she came by this something? She asked. No. She didn't trust the post. He swallowed. But she asked me to come to Little Bramble. Said she wanted to talk in person. I arrived the day of the fête. Yet you did not speak to her, Miss Marple observed. Daniel's hands curled into fists. I tried. I saw her at a distance. She was carrying a tray of glasses. Then, she disappeared into the crowd. I thought I would wait. No need to cause trouble with her employers by rushing at her in public. He paused, eyes clouded with regret. I went to the edge of the green to smoke. That's when I saw her again. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. When was this? After midday, Daniel said firmly. Near the side lane that leads behind Hardwell's store. She wasn't wearing her apron then, just the blue dress. He swallowed. She was arguing with someone. Someone? Miss Marple repeated softly. Or Mr. Hardwell? Daniel looked at her sharply. You already suspected him. I have no firm suspicions, Miss Marple said mildly. Only observations. He exhaled. Yes, it was Mr. Hardwell. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but Elsie looked frightened. Not angry, not weeping. Frightened. He was standing too close to her. His hand was on her arm. She tried to pull back. And what did you do? Miss Marple asked. I started toward them, but just then a group of villagers came down the lane from the fête. Hardwell jerked his hand away, stepped back and said something I couldn't hear. Elsie walked quickly toward the north path. She looked back once, then disappeared behind the hedges. Daniel's voice dropped. That was the last time I saw her. Miss Marple considered this in silence. The official version, repeated by half the village, placed Elsie's disappearance before noon on the way to fetch lemonade. But Daniel had seen her afternoon, without her apron, arguing with Mr. Hardwell. Someone, it seemed, had shifted the timeline to suit a particular story. And you did not tell the constable this? Miss Marple asked gently. I tried, Daniel said bitterly. But what was I supposed to say? Hello, I'm a stranger no one knows. I've been secretly watching your villagers. And by the way, your respectable shopkeeper was manhandling a maid. Behind his store? He shook his head. They'd either laugh or arrest me. People in villages, Miss Marple said, are very fond of known quantities. Strangers are inconvenient, especially when they bring troubling information. Exactly. Daniel's gaze hardened. But I know what I saw, and I know Elsie. She wouldn't run away without telling me. Not after everything that happened before. Before, Miss Marple repeated mildly. He hesitated. She worked in Ridgeford before this, he said, in a doctor's house. They accused her of stealing jewelry, money. She swore she didn't. She said she'd seen things in the doctor's accounts that didn't add up. When she tried to ask questions, she was dismissed. Quietly. No fuss. Just a stain on her name. His voice dropped. She always believed she was pushed out because she knew too much. Miss Marple thought of the backroom key, the letters, the argument. A pattern was forming, one that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with money and secrecy. And now you think, Miss Marple said gently, that history has repeated itself. Daniel's expression was bleak. I think she discovered something again, and this time someone made sure she couldn't talk about it. A breeze stirred the hedges, carrying with it the faint sounds of village life. A dog barking, a cart rattling on the lane, the distant toll of the church clock. "Tell me, Mr. Carter," Miss Marple said after a moment, "why warn me? Why not simply leave the village?" "Because I've been watching," he said quietly. "People speak to you. They trust you. And that man, Hardwell, does not like that you're looking around." "Oh dear," Miss Marple replied. "Men like Mr. Hardwell rarely enjoy being looked around." Daniel's mouth twitched despite himself. "I'm not here to threaten you," he went on. "But you should know, whoever wanted Elsie gone, they're not finished. Last night I saw someone sneaking around the mill. Lantern hidden, moving carefully, not searching, checking." "Checking what, I wonder?" Miss Marple murmured. "Probably whether anyone's found what they left there," Daniel said. "Or making sure nothing else of hers turns up." His eyes darkened. "This isn't over. And if they realize you're putting the pieces together—" "Mr. Carter," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "people often underestimate old ladies. It's one of the few advantages of getting on in years. I assure you I'm quite used to it." He stared at her, then gave a short, strangled laugh. "You don't scare easily, do you?" "Oh, I am often frightened," Miss Marple said. "I simply find it more useful to be observant at the same time." She laid a light hand on his arm. "If you truly wish to help your cousin," she said, "you must do exactly as I say. No dramatic confrontations. No accusations in the street. You will keep watching, but from a distance, and you will not, under any circumstance, attempt to investigate the mill or the store alone." Daniel frowned. "And what will you do?" Miss Marple's eyes grew very mild. "I," she said, "will pay a few calls, ask a few questions, and see whose story becomes just a little too tidy." That evening, as the sky began to darken, the village was jarred by a new disturbance. A bell clanged furiously. Smoke curled, not from a chimney but from the direction of the high street, Hardwells' general store. By the time villagers reached it, they found Constable Reed shouting orders and Mr. Hardwell standing outside, pale and shaken, as flames licked from a side window. "Backroom smoldering," someone cried. "Looks like something was set alight." Miss Marple arrived at the edge of the gathering crowd, her eyes going straight, not to the fire, but to Mr. Hardwell's face. He was stricken, not with the distress of a man watching his livelihood burn, but with the terror of someone watching evidence disappear, or fail to. Because if the fire had begun in the back room, there was one thing Miss Marple knew with absolute certainty. Someone had decided that whatever Elsie found there needed to vanish, even if the whole village watched it burn. The flames at Hardwell's general store were brought under control sooner than expected, thanks to the quick actions of several villagers and the blessedly short distance between the shop and the village water pump. But even as buckets were thrown, windows shattered, and smoke billowed upward like a dark confession, Miss Marple stood very still at the edge of the crowd, observing every face illuminated by the flickering orange light. Some faces showed fear, some showed curiosity, one showed desperation. Mr. Hardwell stood rigid, his hands clutching at nothing, his eyes fixed on the burning side room, the back room. His wife sobbed quietly beside him, though her gaze kept darting toward her husband rather than the fire. Constable Reed pushed through the smoke, coughing. "Fire started near the shelving," he told the gathering. "Looks like possibly an accident." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose ever so slightly. "Accidents," she said softly, "tend not to begin in locked rooms." Reed blinked at her. "Locked?" "Oh, yes," Miss Marple said lightly. "Mr. Hardwell is very particular." The shopkeeper gave a sharp stare in her direction, one that held too much fury for a man under stress. "Miss Marple," he snapped, "this is no time for idle speculation. My livelihood is at stake." "And perhaps more," she murmured. He stiffened. Then Reed called, "Sir, you'd better come see this." Hardwell hesitated, only for a heartbeat but too noticeably, before following. Miss Marple moved too at a gentle pace that never suggested she was intruding. Inside the charred doorway, the smell of burnt wood mingled with a sharper scent. Scorched paper. "Seems something fell behind the shelving before the fire reached it," Reed said, stooping. He reached down and lifted a blackened, half-burnt book. A ledger. Hardwell blanched. That's old stock records," he stammered. "Nothing important." Miss Marple's head tilted. How fortunate it survived when the rest did not. Reed flipped through the pages, squinting. "These numbers, they don't match the current store accounts, not even close." Hardwell lunged forward. "Give me that." But Reed stepped back. "Sir, I need to take this for evidence until the cause of the fire is confirmed." Hardwell's face went deathly pale. "Evidence? This is outrageous." Miss Marple met his furious gaze with a mild, grandmotherly one. "Fires," she said softly, "can be so very revealing." Later that evening, once the fire was out and the crowd had dispersed, Miss Marple walked home with measured steps. Daniel Carter appeared beside her from a darkened doorway, eyes sharp with urgency. "You saw him," he said. "He panicked when the ledger appeared." "Oh, yes," Miss Marple replied, "quite remarkably." "Do you think Elsie saw that ledger?" "I think she saw something Mr. Hardwell very much wished she hadn't." Daniel exhaled shakily. Then he did something to her. Miss Marple paused beneath a lamppost, the dim yellow light falling over her silver hair. "Young man," she said gently, "never let fear outrun fact. Panic can make the innocent foolish and the guilty reckless. Tonight Mr. Hardwell was certainly the latter, but we must not leap to conclusions." Daniel clenched his fists. "But she was afraid of him." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed softly. "And that fear has now been confirmed. But fear does not always indicate the most obvious danger." Daniel stared at her. "You think someone else was involved?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I think someone helped." The next morning, Miss Marple visited the Hardwell residence again. Mrs. Hardwell opened the door with reddened eyes and trembling hands. "Oh, Miss Marple," she whispered, "what shall we do? First Elsie, now the fire. Someone must be tormenting us." Miss Marple stepped inside the drawing room, watching the woman closely. "It is certainly distressing, my dear. But fires rarely start themselves. One must always consider motive." Mrs. Hardwell looked frightened. "Harold wouldn't. He couldn't." Miss Marple smiled gently. "I never mentioned your husband." The woman froze. Then she whispered, "You must think I'm a fool. I know people suspect him. And now the ledger, the talk, the police coming in and out." Miss Marple waited. Mrs. Hardwell's voice quavered. "Elsie said something to me last week. Something I dismissed. Oh, I should never have ignored it." "What did she say?" Miss Marple asked. "That someone had been in the back room at night, not Harold, someone else." She wrung her hands. "She said she heard them, twice." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "And did you believe her?" I told her she was imagining things. I thought she'd misunderstood. I thought she was trying to make trouble." "Why would she do that?" Miss Marple asked softly. Mrs. Hardwell looked at the floor. "Because she knew something. She said so. I thought it was childish dramatics. But now..." Miss Marple touched her arm lightly. "When fear prevents honesty, it often delays justice." Mrs. Hardwell burst into tears. Miss Marple left her gently sobbing and stepped into the cool morning air. Someone besides Mr. Hardwell had been in that back room, and Elsie had known who. As Miss Marple walked home, she noticed a figure waiting just outside her garden gate. Mr. Aberline, the gardener. He looked miserable, eyes bloodshot, cap twisting in his large hands. "Miss Marple," he croaked, "I need to talk to you, please." "Of course," she said, unlocking the gate. "Come in." They stood among her rose bushes. the morning sunlight falling on petals and thorns. "I didn't tell the constable everything," he said thickly. "I couldn't." Miss Marple's voice was soft. "Because you were afraid." He nodded miserably. "Elsie. She came to me 2 nights before she disappeared. She asked me if I'd seen anyone near the store after it closed." He looked away. "And I had." Miss Marple's breath stilled. "Who?" she asked quietly. Aberline swallowed. "Lucy Farnham." Miss Marple felt a quiet, cold certainty settle into place. Mr. Hardwell had secrets. Elsie had discovered them. The fire was meant to erase proof. But Lucy, jealous, insecure Lucy, had been sneaking around the store at night, and Elsie knew. Miss Marple folded her hands calmly. "Mr. Aberline," she said gently, "thank you. You've just told me exactly what I needed to know." Because the next move in the mystery no longer belonged to Mr. Hardwell, but to Lucy Farnham, and Miss Marple was already planning how to speak to her. Not with accusation, but with the quiet, piercing truth only she could wield. Lucy Farnham lived in a small stone cottage near the post office, its windows lined with potted geraniums and lace curtains that suggested a tidy, orderly life. But Miss Marple knew better than to trust tidy appearances. In her long experience, some of the darkest fears hid behind lace. She knocked softly. After a moment, Lucy opened the door just a crack, eyes wide, hair unbrushed, face pale. "Oh, Miss Marple." Her voice trembled. Is everything all right?" "That depends," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "May I come in?" Lucy hesitated, too long before stepping aside. The sitting room was neat, excessively so, as if someone had cleaned it quickly to erase signs of distress. A half-burned letter sat in the fireplace grate, its edge curling like a guilty gesture. Miss Marple glanced at it once, long enough to note it, before settling into an armchair. "My dear," she began softly, "there are some matters we must talk about. Difficult matters." Lucy's hands twisted in her lap. Am I in trouble?" "Not at all," Miss Marple said kindly, "unless there is something you have not yet told the constable. Or me." Lucy swallowed hard. Miss Marple continued, her tone gentle but precise. "You were seen near Hardwell's store late at night." Lucy's breath hitched. "Who said that?" "Someone who wishes you no harm," Miss Marple replied. "But truth has a way of surfacing when needed." Lucy stared at the floor. It's not what you think." "My dear," Miss Marple said softly, "I have found that very few things are what one thinks. That is why we must clarify them." Lucy's eyes filled with tears. "I wasn't doing anything wrong. I only wanted to know." "To know what?" Miss Marple asked. Lucy hesitated, caught between fear and relief. "What Elsie was hiding." Miss Marple nodded. There it was, finally spoken aloud. "You suspected her of something." Lucy wiped her eyes. "Everyone liked her. Everyone talked about how sweet she was, how hard-working, how pretty. No one ever notices when I walk into a room. But Elsie, she'd been here 5 minutes, and every man in the village looked her way." "Jealousy," Miss Marple murmured, "is a very old and very human emotion." Lucy shook her head. "It wasn't just that. She'd been going to the store often. Too often, and one night I followed her. She slipped into the alley beside the shop. She wasn't alone." Miss Marple leaned forward. "Who was she with?" Lucy bit her lip. "Mr. Hardwell." Miss Marple remained still. "Go on." I couldn't hear what they were saying, but she gave him something. A small bundle. Papers, I think. He grabbed it and looked furious. She backed away from him. Then she said something I couldn't hear and ran off. "And you went to the store afterward," Miss Marple said. Lucy nodded miserably. "I thought maybe there was something she had hidden there. something she didn't want people to know. I thought, stupidly, that maybe she'd been lying about everything, that she was tricking people again, like at her last job. Miss Marple's voice remained warm, not accusing. You thought if you uncovered something, people might see you instead. Lucy let out a sob. Yes. And did you find anything? No, the back room was locked. I only looked through the window, but... She hesitated. I saw Mr. Hardwell there one night. Late. Going through papers. Stuffing something into a satchel. Miss Marple pressed her fingertips together. Did he see you? Lucy shook her head. I don't think so. And on the morning of the fête... Lucy looked down. Elsie told me she had gotten another letter. She said everything would be clear soon. I tried to talk to her, but she ran off. Miss Marple allowed a moment of silence to settle. Lucy, she said gently, you must tell the constable. Lucy shook her head frantically. I can't. If people find out I was spying... My dear, Miss Marple said softly, the safety of a young woman may depend on it, and if you do not speak now, I believe someone else will make certain you never do. Lucy shuddered. You mean Mr. Hardwell? I mean someone with very grave motives, Miss Marple said quietly. And someone who now knows that people are watching more closely than they should. Lucy covered her face with her hands. I'm scared. Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on her arm. Fear is natural, but telling the truth often dispels it. There was a long pause. Then Lucy whispered, All right, I'll tell Constable Reed. Everything. Miss Marple smiled warmly. Good girl. As she stepped back outside, Miss Marple did not head home. Instead, she took a quiet detour around the back of Hardwell's store. The fire had gutted part of the wall, leaving a blackened frame around the back room window. She studied the burn pattern. It was wrong, too focused, too deliberate. The fire had been started from the inside, on a shelf where documents were stored. And then she noticed something else in the ash. A fragment of paper, half burned but still legible. Miss Marple crouched, carefully lifting it with her handkerchief. A number, then another, then a word. Order 17B, unaccounted stock. Her eyes softened with understanding. So that was it. Fraud. Books cooked quietly. Stock recorded but never purchased. Profits disappearing into pockets. Elsie had stumbled onto it. The fire was meant to erase the proof, but someone, not Mr. Hardwell, had ensured at least one fragment survived. She rose slowly. Lucy had seen Hardwell sneaking at night, but someone else had been in that room too. Someone who knew the accounts better than anyone. Someone who had the most access, and the most to lose. Miss Marple took a slow breath. The next suspect had just revealed themselves, not through a mistake, but through the absence of one. Mrs. Hardwell, the woman who handled receipts, the woman who ran the register, the woman who never left her husband's side, except on the nights the back room was visited. But that was not the only possibility, because another person kept records, another person handled deliveries, another person was always near the store, and often near Elsie. Mr. Aberline, the gardener, the helper, the man with keys entrusted to him when needed. And suddenly, the man's trembling confession earlier felt incomplete, very incomplete. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed with calm precision. The net was tightening. But the truth, she knew, required one more push, one more piece, one more test. That moment was coming soon, very soon. The morning after Lucy's confession dawned grey and windless, a strange stillness hanging over Little Bramble like a held breath. Miss Marple felt it the moment she stepped outside. Villages often grew quietest just before truth forced its way to the surface. She had two tasks that day: to speak with Constable Reed, to see who panicked before she asked a single question. It was almost always the panic that solved the case. Miss Marple found Reed outside the Half Moon Inn, speaking in low tones with the innkeeper. His expression shifted from weary to relieved when he spotted her. Miss Marple. Good. I was about to come find you. Is that so, Constable? I hope not with bad news. Reed hesitated. Depends how one sees it. We've made a discovery? Miss Marple folded her hands. Tell me everything. Reed swallowed. The search party went toward the river again. About 20 yards upstream from the mill, they found... He paused. Found what, Constable? A scrap of cloth. He sighed. Blue. From Elsie's dress. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And where was it? Caught on a reed. Right near a shallow bend. Reed rubbed his forehead. People are saying the worst. People often do, Miss Marple murmured, especially when prompted. Reed's head jerked up. Prompted? By whom? That, Constable, Miss Marple said gently, is the question we must answer. Miss Marple walked to the mill on her own. She suspected someone else would be there first. She was correct. Through the broken slat of the lower window, she saw movement, a hunched figure rummaging through the dusted corner near the trap door. Mr. Aberline, the gardener, the man who had remembered wrongly, the man who had been frightened, the man who had keys for half the village's outbuildings, including, occasionally, the store. Miss Marple stepped inside quietly. Looking for something, Mr. Aberline? He jumped, nearly dropping the small lantern he held. Miss Marple, I was just checking, making sure nothing had been moved. Yes, she said softly. One often checks a place one knows very well. He swallowed hard. I didn't do anything. I swear. I heard about the cloth near the river. Thought maybe she had been nearby. And oddly enough, Miss Marple said, you searched the one corner where the dust was disturbed several days ago. His hands shook. I thought I saw... No, Mr. Aberline, she said, her voice gentle but unyielding. You knew what you were looking for. His face twisted. She shouldn't have taken the key. She shouldn't have meddled. Ah, there it was. A confession, not of the crime, but of knowledge. You lent her the key, Miss Marple said, or she took it from you. I only gave her what she asked for, he burst out. She said she needed to check something that would help her, prove herself. And what did she show you? Miss Marple asked. He hesitated. A list, he whispered. A list of items missing from the store. She said Mr. Hardwell had been keeping 2 sets of books. She wanted to confront him. She thought he'd have to admit it. Miss Marple exhaled softly. And you believed her? Yes, he muttered. I knew something wasn't right. Deliveries that didn't match orders. Crates that arrived half full. Hardwell blaming his clerks. So you helped her, Miss Marple said. He looked at the floor. I only meant to help. And then, she said gently, someone saw the two of you. His silence confirmed it. But she suddenly knew something else. Something important. He was not the killer. He was frightened, loyal, confused, but not violent, not calculating. And Miss Marple needed to confirm her new theory before the true culprit grew bold. Just after midday, a scream tore through Little Bramble. It came from the river bank. Miss Marple arrived moments later. Lucy Farnham was standing in the shallows, shaking violently, shoes soaked. Constable Reed ran to her. Lucy, what happened? Lucy pointed a trembling hand. There, in the water. A satchel, a heavy one. Reed hauled it out. The villagers leaned in. Inside, soaked but intact, were pages of financial records, folded invoices, duplicate ledgers, and a small bundle of letters addressed to Elsie Harper. Never posted, Miss Marple watched the faces around her. Mr. Hardwell went white. Mrs. Hardwell began shaking, lips whispering prayers. Mr. Aberline looked stunned. Daniel Carter clenched his fists. Lucy fell to her knees, sobbing. But one person moved differently. One person backed away, not with horror, but with calculation. Constable Reed spotted it too. "Mrs. Hardwell, are you all right?" She blinked rapidly. I can't, this can't." Miss Marple stepped toward her. "My dear," she said softly, "you recognize these papers." Mrs. Hardwell broke. "I didn't mean," she whispered. "I only wanted to protect us. I didn't hurt her. I swear I didn't hurt her." Reed stiffened. "Protect you from what, Mrs. Hardwell?" She shook her head frantically. "It was mistakes, small mistakes. Harold didn't mean to take money. He thought the store would bounce back. We'd repay everything. But then Elsie found the old invoices." "She confronted you?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Hardwell sobbed. "She confronted me, not Harold. She thought I was the one keeping the books wrong. And she was right. I panicked." Reed's face hardened. "But I swear," Mrs. Hardwell cried, "I never laid a hand on her. She ran away from me. I never saw her again." Miss Marple believed her, but the case was not closed. If Mrs. Hardwell had panicked, someone else had acted. Someone who feared the consequences even more. Someone who had known exactly where to dump the satchel in the river. Miss Marple turned slowly, and her eyes settled, not on Hardwell, not on Lucy, not on Aberline, but on Daniel Carter. For he alone had stood nearest the riverbank for hours. He alone knew Elsie's habits and fears. He alone had a connection strong enough to manipulate the story, and he alone had spotted the satchel's location too quickly to be coincidence. Miss Marple's voice was gentle, almost grandmotherly. "Mr. Carter," she said, "I believe it is time you told us the truth. All of it." Daniel froze. The real twist had finally arrived. A hush fell over the riverbank. Even the water seemed to hold still as though waiting. Daniel Carter did not move. His eyes darted once toward the satchel, then toward Lucy, then toward the path leading out of the village. Calculating, searching, cornered. Miss Marple stepped closer, her voice very calm, very soft. "Mr. Carter," she said, "Elsie was a clever girl, brave too. But bravery without caution can be dangerous. She trusted you, perhaps more than she should have." Daniel swallowed, jaw tightening. "I don't know what you mean." "Oh," Miss Marple replied mildly. "I think you do." Constable Reed looked between them, confused. "Miss Marple, are you saying—" "I am only asking questions, Constable," she said, "asking the one person whose story never varied at all." Daniel flinched. Miss Marple continued gently. Everyone else contradicted themselves at least once, changed small details, remembered something new, even lied clumsily. You, however, young man, have been quite perfect. Daniel's voice dropped to a whisper. "I told you the truth." "Indeed," Miss Marple said. "But truth, when polished too much, becomes suspicious, like a story rehearsed." A ripple of nervous murmuring spread among the villagers. Miss Marple looked directly into Daniel's eyes. "You told us you saw Elsie arguing with Mr. Hardwell, yet no one else saw that, not even those who passed that lane at the same time." Daniel's jaw clenched. "They weren't looking." "Perhaps," Miss Marple allowed. "But then there is another matter. You said you saw someone checking the mill at night, and again, no one else saw a lantern." "Only you." Daniel's throat bobbed. "I was watching. I told you. I was worried." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured, "and that is what troubles me. You always saw what no one else did. You always appeared just when the conversation needed a nudge. And the satchel," she turned to Reed. "Constable, you found it exactly where Daniel was standing." Reed blinked. "Yes, he was the one who pointed at it," Miss Marple said. "Precisely." Daniel shifted his weight backward. Barely an inch, but enough. Miss Marple's voice cooled, though her tone remained polite. "You planted it there, did you not? The satchel, the letters, the duplicate ledgers." A gasp ran through the villagers. Daniel stepped back again. "You're lying." "Oh no," Miss Marple said softly. "Lying is far too crude for this. You wanted to shift suspicion, to make the Hardwells seem responsible for Elsie's disappearance. You brought those papers here yourself. They were not soaked evenly. Only the outside was wet." Reed's eyes widened. He opened the satchel again. Miss Marple was right. The inner pages were barely damp. Daniel's breathing grew unsteady. "You wanted to blame Hardwell," Miss Marple continued, "because you believed, truly believed, that he had wronged Elsie. But the truth, my dear boy, is far simpler." Her voice gentled, not accusing, but sorrowful. "You followed Elsie. You heard her confrontation with Mrs. Hardwell. You knew she had found dangerous information. And when she tried to run, you tried to stop her." Daniel shook his head violently. No, I was trying to help her. I told you." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, trying to help her escape her fears, but she did not want rescuing. She wanted justice. She wanted to reveal the truth. And you, terrified of losing her, terrified of watching her suffer again, grabbed her." Daniel froze. Slowly, Miss Marple whispered, "Elsie stumbled, didn't she? She pulled away, lost her footing on the riverbank. And you—" He gasped once, then twice. "You tried to grab her again, but by then it was too late." Daniel let out a strangled sound, something between a sob and a groan. Miss Marple continued, voice gentle and unrelenting. "She fell into the water, struck her head on the stones, a tragic accident, but an accident nonetheless. You panicked. You thought no one would believe you. You feared they'd blame you. So you hid her body downstream, farther than the searchers looked, and then you began rearranging the story." Daniel sank to his knees. "I just wanted to protect her," he whispered. "She was all I had left." Miss Marple approached him with soft steps. "And now, Mr. Carter, the kindest thing you can do for Elsie and for yourself is tell the rest of the truth." Daniel covered his face with his hands. "I never meant to hurt her. I swear to God I didn't." Constable Reed stepped forward, face pale, voice steady. "Daniel Carter, I'm placing you under arrest on suspicion of involuntary manslaughter and obstruction of justice." Daniel didn't resist. He simply allowed himself to be led away, shoulders trembling. As the villagers murmured and the river flowed quietly past, Miss Marple remained still, watching the fallen young man disappear into the lane. Her voice, barely above a whisper, carried only to herself. Poor child, so much love, so little wisdom. But she was not done. There was still the matter of the Hardwells' secret bookkeeping. There were still other truths to be addressed, and the village, shaken but listening, waited for her final clarity. Constable Reed escorted Daniel Carter toward the station, the young man's figure growing smaller against the pale afternoon light. A hush settled over the villagers gathered by the riverbank. No triumph, no satisfaction, only the slow, dawning realization that tragedy had a way of finding even the gentlest corners of England. Miss Marple remained where she stood for a moment longer, her eyes lowered, her hands folded neatly before her. She never rejoiced in being right. She simply acknowledged the truth as she always had, with sadness and acceptance. She finally turned to Constable Reed. "We must still recover Elsie's body, Constable." Reed nodded solemnly. "We'll begin downstream." He said he tucked her near the reeds. "I'll see to it." "And," Miss Marple added softly, "you will also need to speak with Mr. and Mrs. Hardwell." Reed flushed. "Yes, about the bookkeeping. I don't think they realized anyone else had noticed." "Oh, I believe Mrs. Hardwell realized," Miss Marple said mildly. "She was not protecting her husband, you see. She was protecting herself." Reed blinked. Her. Miss Marple nodded. She kept the accounts. It was she who tried to patch the shortages. She who misplaced invoices. She who fueled her husband's belief that the business was failing from misfortune rather than dishonesty. Mr. Hardwell may have benefited, but he did not comprehend the full picture. Reed exhaled. So she panicked when Elsie confronted her. Yes, Miss Marple said. The poor woman had lived so long in fear of being discovered that when Elsie confronted her, she mistook a frightened girl's honesty for a threat. It happens rather often, especially when one is ashamed. And the fire? A foolish attempt to destroy evidence, Miss Marple replied. But not a malicious one. She hoped no one would be inside, and she did not expect Daniel's panic to drag the entire village into chaos. Reed shook his head. None of them meant harm, and yet... Yes, Miss Marple said gently. Harm came all the same, as it so often does. The Hardwells sat in their parlor, both pale and exhausted. Mrs. Hardwell wept softly. Mr. Hardwell stared into the fire grate, his expression worn and defeated. Miss Marple explained the matter to them, not harshly, but with the quiet firmness of someone who understood human weakness all too well. You must tell Constable Reed everything, she said. Not to condemn yourselves, but to begin again honestly. Secrets have a way of poisoning households. Mrs. Hardwell nodded through her tears. I never meant to hurt the girl. I only wanted to keep my marriage from falling apart. Harold had no idea. I hid things from him. Mr. Hardwell's jaw clenched with shame. And I was too proud to ask why things were going wrong. Miss Marple gave a sympathetic nod. Then learn from it. Guilt grows only in darkness. Let the constable sort the legal matters. Time will sort the rest. They thanked her brokenly. Miss Marple left with a slow, steady step. Elsie's body was found just before dusk, resting gently among the reeds downstream, just as Daniel had said. She looked peaceful, as though she had simply fallen asleep beside the water. Her story ended where panic, fear, and misunderstanding had collided. Reed removed his hat. The villagers bowed their heads. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a brief moment, offering a silent prayer. Poor girl, she whispered. Back in her neat little cottage, Miss Marple poured herself a cup of tea and sat in her favorite armchair, the one that faced the garden. She did not knit that evening. She simply sat quietly, thinking of Elsie, clever and hopeful, who had wanted to fix injustices greater than herself. Of Daniel, whose love had turned to fear and led to tragedy. Of Mrs. Hardwell, whose desperate bookkeeping had spiraled into deception. Of a village that had tried to bury its troubles beneath politeness until truth forced itself into daylight. Human nature, Miss Marple knew, was not wicked by default, merely impulsive, frightened, confused, and sometimes all too capable of harm when trying to avoid shame. She sighed softly. Such a sad business, she murmured, and all because honesty came too late. Yet she also knew the village would heal. Little Bramble always did. The villagers would bake scones again, host fêtes again, gossip about harmless things again. Life, for all its tragedies, had a way of continuing. The next morning, the first sunbeam crossed her windowsill, lighting the rim of her teacup, and Miss Marple finally picked up her knitting once more. Click, click, click. As rhythmically and calmly as the gentle restoration of peace in Little Bramble. The maid who vanished at noon had been found, and the truth, terrible, tangled, and human as ever, had been laid to rest.